a VFX supervisor walked through the machine room and said, "Hey, did you do that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "It's pretty good. You're looking for a job?" And I became completely obsessed because it married the two things that were interesting to me: science fiction, living in this idea of tomorrow, and art.
Hello and welcome to Everyone Is. I am your host, Jennifer Coronado. The intent of this show is to engage with all types of people and build an understanding that anyone who has any kind of success has achieved that success because they are a creative thinker. So whether you are an artist, or a cook, or an award-winning journalist, everyone has something to contribute to the human conversation. And now, as they say, on with the show. Tim Miller is a creative, a VFX entrepreneur, a director of such films as Deadpool and Terminator Dark Fate, and also a writer and executive producer on the Netflix series Love, Death, and Robots. Tim is also known as being a pretty frank person, so we're excited to have the chance to talk to him today about his life's path. Tim Miller, welcome to Everyone Is.
Thank you very much. Where did I get that reputation for being frank?
Well, I've seen lots of interviews with you, but I've also heard it from people working in the industry. I want to start at the very beginning. I want to start at your superhero origin story. So where'd you grow up?
I grew up in middle-class household in Southern Maryland, right across the river from DC, a place called Fort Washington. It was great. It was a great place to grow up. My dad was an interior designer, although he didn't graduate from high school. He faked a degree from college and got into the National Association of Interior Designers. And my mom ran our business, and she was very creative, and she made these little miniature figures. And my dad was very creative. He was a writer. He wanted to be a writer, and he wrote a lot, but he also had a great eye. And even though he never graduated high school, he did a room in the White House, and we did all kinds of stuff for the government and things like that. I hung a lot of drapes, delivered a lot of furniture.
So you were surrounded by creatives as a kid?
Yeah, not in the way that you get when you're out here in Hollywood, where you do this for a living and it's all day, every day, which is great. But people that I think in an older time, there were a lot of creative people that really just had followed sort of a traditional path for their work. But then, creativity sort of bubbles up and comes out in all kinds of places in their lives. And so it was always there.
Did your parents encourage you to draw? Because I know as a little kid, you liked drawing as well.
Yeah. And I wanted to be a comic book artist and realized I wasn't good enough. And I always drew. And then I wanted to be an illustrator. And in fact, I was a freelance illustrator for a while, but I was also waiting a lot of tables to make money. I just love to draw. I would draw anything. And I started by, like a lot of artists do, I would copy Frank Frazetta and comic books. And I painted, my closet doors were John Layton's Iron Man covers. And the bottom of my bed was a Roger Dean green slate painting. And my bookshelves had Wolverine fighting the Hellfire Club painted on them. And so I was always copying, and then I would do my own stuff too. And that's really what I wanted to be, was an editorial illustrator.
So when it comes to comic books, did you find as a young person, you're like, this is the artist I love? Or were you just drawn to the stories first? Or what was the thing that drew you in there that made you want to be in that space?
I've always been kind of a nerdy, really simplistic guy who likes heroes and villains. And, I like my moralizing, very black and white. And I think I was very drawn to comic books, and it combined the two things that I loved most. I love to read. My dad was a huge reader, and he gave me A Princess Bride in 5th grade. And I locked myself in my room for 3 days, and I came out and said, "What happens next? I must know." And then it was every book that Edgar Rice, 27 Tarzans, and every book that Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote. And then it was Robert E. Howard, and so on, and C.S. Forester, and I've never stopped. So comic books was really the marriage of those two things. It was the written word and stories and illustrations. And I can't tell you why I was drawn to one artist or another. I certainly had my favorites.
So interesting you say that. When I was a kid, I loved books so much. I would walk around the house and count how many books we had in the house, because I found it very comforting to know that we had all of these books that that were surrounding us, because there's so much also, comic books are awesome. I loved those as a kid, but there's something to be said about other types of books where it's all your imagination that's generating the imagery. That's why it's always so amazing when you see like a film that actually kind of connects to the book, because sometimes there's big misses because you can put so much more in a book and it comes from you individually.
All too often I've heard writers, where I've worked with writers who are adapting a material and they just don't give a shit about the source material. And I guess if you're hired to adapt a book and perhaps it's not a book that you love, maybe you don't love it because it's not your taste and you feel less precious about it. But all the books that I've adapted, I adapted them because I love them. And I do think that maybe a particular skill I have is how you can adapt it without ruining what is, most essential. Why do I love this book? You have to change things. You have to compress time and you have to drop characters. And how do you do that without ruining the thing that you love? Because if that's the case, then you probably shouldn't adapt it anyway. But we've worked with a lot of writers, and they're kind of rock stars to me, especially with Love, Death, and Robots, because between that and some other things, we've done about 50 short films. 4, I think, were originals, but the rest were stories that I found and really liked by different authors. And we have relationships with them. So I don't want to say, yeah, sorry, I fucked your story up. I try and be as respectful as I can. And I think even when I change things, they understand why. And for the most part, they either agree or pretend to agree. And occasionally they've said, well, what if you did this instead? Because I think this is important. I listen because it's their thing. They created it. I'm just adapting it.
It came from their brain and their soul and their heart, right?
Absolutely. But, I'm not going to adapt Neuromancer and throw away what William Gibson did.
Right.
That's just, I can't even imagine. In fact, my Neuromancer adaptation, Bill Gibson said, was too beholden to the book, and which I thought was kind of funny.
That's really funny. So you're this East Coast kid. You went to school for illustration and animation.
Yep.
And then you went to Hollywood. How did that come about?
There was a lot of stops in between. When I got out of college, I was trying to start a career as an illustrator, and I would get the occasional gigs, but I had waited tables all through college and high school, and I continued to wait tables. I like waiting tables, actually. It's a job that makes time go fast and you can make good money. And so I waited a lot of tables and did that. And then my wife's father had an ex-student who worked at a place in Baltimore that made medical films. And if you got, say, glaucoma, your doctor would sit you down and say, watch this film about glaucoma, and charge you for that time while you were sitting in his office watching a film. So the first film I directed was So You Have an STD. I'm not making that up. That's a true story. But they said, hey, we do the animations to illustrate the concepts, the medical concepts, with this computer called a Dubner 20K. I had never worked on a computer before, except, I'd seen the little Macintosh black and white and maybe an Apple II, but never was interested in it to any extent. And then this was a 256 color paint system with some limited animation. Yep. And so I started on the night shift, and I thought it was the greatest thing in the fucking universe. And I became completely obsessed because it married the two things that were interesting to me: science fiction and living in this idea of tomorrow, and art. And so I became completely obsessed. And then they got a better computer system and I became more obsessed. And then I got a job in Washington, D.C. again. So I moved from Washington to Baltimore and then back to D.C. And while I was working at this post house doing opens for the Discovery Channel and things like that on a compositing system, they asked me to demo out at NAB, which is a big conference. And while I was there, somebody with a post house in Los Angeles said, hey, you want to come out here? Back then in the early 90s, Los Angeles was the mecca of computer graphics. Like, it was where all shit was happening. And I had a friend out here, Jerome Chen, who's one of the big VFX supervisors at Sony. He did a bunch of Spider-Man movies, Men in Black, Fury. And Jerome was working out here at a post house, and he's like, dude, it's fucking great. I'm working on music videos. So I said, yeah, I'll come out and do that. So I came out and worked at this place called Action Video, and I was a compositor. And I wanted to learn 3D because I got so tired of asking the 3D artist. I bought a PC and taught myself 3D because I said, well, fuck, I'll make my own. And then that led to a job at Sony Imageworks.
Yeah.
Showing my friend Jerome some work I had done at home in my spare time, a little personal project. And a VFX supervisor walked through the machine room and said, hey, did you do that? And I said, yeah. And he goes, it's pretty good. You looking for a job? And I said, no. And he goes, well, you want one? Because they needed animators. And so I was hired as an animator, which I had zero training.
Wait. Literally, you accidentally got hired as an animator.
Yeah, I was a compositor.
Yeah.
That wasn't my main focus, but I loved animation. And so I said, sure, I can do it. I always had an abundance of confidence.
Where does that come from? Where does that abundance of confidence come from, do you think?
I think, my parents were very much, weren't really that interested in what I was doing, to be honest. Mm-hmm. Like they were super supportive, but they weren't unsupportive either, right? So I would go, hey, I want to be an artist. And my dad would go, all right, sure. Why not? And I'd go, okay. And I'd be an artist. But it came from, I don't know, being lucky. I mean, I often think in the lottery of life, I was given so much that people consider things that shouldn't be an advantage, like being a dude. But let's face it, it is. Being a white dude, again, shouldn't be an advantage, but it is, I have to admit. And being lucky enough to be born in a household that could send you to college, hugely fucking fortunate. Being born in America, also hugely fortunate. So, I mean, I'm already in like the top 1% of lucky. And if I fucked it up, I mean, I would have to be some kind of idiot, right? And I had a little bit of talent that if you work hard enough, you can make it count more because you're given opportunities that other people don't have. Luck, really?
You started your own visual effects company, Blur, and you were pretty young, and you started in the 90s. What gave you so is that all this stuff that you built on, is that what gave you the confidence to start your own company, or did you want to set your own rules? What drove you towards that?
I always had a highly developed opinion of right and wrong. In hindsight, of course, I was not always right or wrong, but I believed it. Jeff Fowler, who is a Blur director, directs the Sonic movies. Jeff says, Tim Miller frequently wrong, but never in doubt. Somebody else said the other day, Tim Miller, ready, fire, aim. I thought that was funny. So I think that comes from maybe too much confidence. But honestly, when you get down to it, when I left Sony, really because I didn't want to be an entrepreneur. I had worked on Hideaway and I'd worked on Johnny Mnemonic, moved to the PC department at Sony, which was nothing back then because they were doing Johnny Mnemonic, which was one of my favorite short stories. And I knew PCs. And even then I could see the writing was on the wall that, I worked in a department where my workstation cost about $40,000 and the software that ran on it was like another $40,000. But at home, I was working on a PC that cost like $2,000 and on software that costs about $1,200. And I'm like, I can do 60% on this. And every year it gets better. Every 6 months it gets better. I saw the writing on the wall that it was all going to change. And by the time I left Sony, it was because you could buy the software and the hardware without, $1 million investment. So we took a $20,000 loan and bought 3 computers.
Who's the we in that case?
It was this woman named Kat Chapman, who was our department manager in the Sony previs department. That's who worked on Johnny Mnemonic. Even though we did final shots, it was the previs department. It was her and another artist named David Stennett. And then eventually my best friend from childhood, who is a programmer, became our CTO, joined in year 2. And then Jennifer Miller, who I was married to and was a designer, she joined in like year 3. We went pretty quickly from like 3 people to 20 or so. And maybe within the first year and a half. And then we kind of just kept growing.
You started a business and you're a creative person, and sometimes those things don't map. Like sometimes it's people who are creative, they're challenged on one side, or the business people are challenged on the creative side. So who took what role in that setting up of a company? Were you driving most of it, or how did you look at it?
Before I answer that, I'll just say that the answer to the first part of your question was, did it come from an abundance of confidence that I was able to start the company? But I will say that at Sony, after we finished Johnny Mnemonic, I said, let me go get some work like Battlestar Galactica or Deep Space Nine. All that stuff was being done on PCs.
Right.
And I said, let me go get that stuff for their apartment because it's fucking cool. And Sony wasn't interested. It wasn't worth their time. And so they didn't want that. And so I said, well, I'll go get it. Let me just try. And they said, no, we don't want that. And so I'm like, okay, well, I guess I have to start my own company. I had some job offers to go back, like make a lot of money and be a compositor on commercials and music videos and stuff. But I'd had enough of that. I didn't want to do it anymore. And I've never really cared about money. And so anyway, I said, okay, well, let's just start our own company. How hard can it be? Right. And maybe it sounds a little scary, but really, if we failed, what happens? We go back to our high paying jobs in the visual effects industry. I mean, and you sign your house as collateral for an equipment purchase. It felt like a low risk.
How do you make that transition? And were you the one guiding that? Your business? How were your business partners working with you?
I'm not a smart business guy, but I'm pretty practical. And though I don't care about money, I understand that people aren't going to work for you unless you pay them, and you need to pay rent, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that I didn't really care about money, I think it was an advantage, even though most of the time people thought it wasn't an advantage. And I'll explain that. I've lost count of the times over Blur's history where we would do a job, we would underbid it, or our own creative expectations were more than the budget allowed just because we were artists and wanted to do something super cool. And I was willing to lose money to make it happen. If I just cared about the money, I would say, well, look, let's just do the minimum to make the client happy and keep them coming back. But I was never trying to keep the client happy. I was trying to keep me happy, right? So we would go above and beyond. And if it wasn't good enough, we would lose money versus going to the client and say, look, we're sorry, or asking for more money, because you can't follow your work around and go, yeah, it's not that good, but honestly, the client didn't give us much money, or we didn't have enough time, or we got fucked in some way. So there is no excuse to put out bad work. I mean, there are excuses, but nobody wants to hear them. So I did everything I could to not have that happen, even to the detriment of the company and the people. Sometimes, we had a bit of a rep as a sweatshop, but it was never because we were making money. It was because we wanted to do better work than perhaps we were getting paid to do. But over time, that builds a very loyal clientele, and it attracts better artists because the work is better. And that pays real dividends in a business where the work is your calling card. If it's great work, artists want to come, and clients want to work with you. And then the money kind of takes care of well, I'm not going to say that because that's insulting to producers. The money doesn't take care of itself, but the work becomes the thing that defines you.
I heard someone who interviewed you once say Blur is like a gym. You go there when you want to get buff. And what do you think he meant by that?
Because expectations are very high. I can't tell you what it was. I mean, I always worked hard in long hours, and back in the days when we didn't get OT or anything, because I loved it. I was interested. I wanted to do good work, and I didn't care about money, and I was so into it. And so that attitude pervaded, probably the first 15 or 20 years of Blur. And we had an all staff model. We didn't pay overtime. We tried to compensate people by saying, take comp time, take the weekends off when you can, and things like that. But we didn't really track it. And it was full of a lot of young, aggressively eager people who were just trying to do great work, and everybody was competing with everybody else in a healthy way. I mean, we had a good time. And a lot of these guys, like Richard Bluff, your friend, would say it was some of the best times of their lives, even though we're working our asses off,
What are some of your proudest accomplishments? I can tell you what my favorite work of you guys is. I love the credits for the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Yeah.
I thought that was so creative and so visually interesting, and really was tonally exactly what the film needed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm certainly proud of that. I would never put it at the top of my personal list because, so much of that was Fincher. Even though David was he's very hands off, but also very hands on.
Yeah.
Right. At the beginning, he sends me an email with 8 words. That's it. And then I said, okay, yeah, well, we're in. And then I said, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to tell the whole story of all 3 books in 2.5 minutes. I read all 3 books and came up with a visual style. We put a bunch of ways like we could handle sort of abstract vignettes. And he really liked these performance art pieces where this dude would go into a museum and pour black oil all over himself and stand in a corner. Weird. And he's like, I want that black on black dream stuff is what he called it. So I said, okay, well, what do you want the vignettes to be? And he goes, I'll get back to you. And after a day or so, I just said, well, how about if I write a bunch and you can tell me which ones you like? And so I wrote like 50, and I thought, oh, well, he'll pick 20. But he said, these are all great. Go.
You know how many takes he does. Come on.
We just get along really well. He's exacting, but so are we. There were many things, like Rockfish was a huge thing for me. I worked so many 100-hour weeks, and I was very proud of it. Love, Death, and Robots is a huge thing.
Yeah.
Deadpool in a very different sort of a way, but I'm prouder of Love, Death, and Robots, to be honest.
Well, I'm excited to see what you have. I do want to dig into Deadpool a little bit, because I famously remember that you guys did a test that helped get the film greenlit, and I think you focused on that movie for like 5 or 6 years before it was done. So how did that all come about, and why was that important to you?
There's an executive at Fox named Drew Crivello, who's still a very good friend, and he's a writer now. But Drew was working on X-Men First Class, and he saw a DC Universe Online piece I did, which was a big superhero fight. And he was working on X-Men First Class, and he said, hey, any chance he tracked me down and came down to meet at Blur and said, you clearly understand superhero action. Would you help design some action for X-Men First Class? And I said, sure. And I can't remember what I said or which way the conversation went, but we talked for an hour or two. And then at the end of it, he said, I don't think you should be working for another director. I think you should be directing. And I was directing, cinematics and things like that. And he said, I can't get you on a big movie because the first time director is not going to fly, but there's this thing called Deadpool. And I said, oh, yeah, well, I read the leaked script and it was amazing. The script was amazing. And so then I met with Lawrence Shuler Donner and I met with Ryan. And then I did the test that famously leaked. And we did a budget, and sadly, Drew left like a few months before we got to the point where they say, make the movie or not make the movie. Had he stayed, we might have made it then, because he was very savvy executive. But we got to that point where we had a budget and we had a plan and we had that test, and Fox just said, nah, we don't see it. We don't want to do it. And then everybody walks away quickly, right? The boss doesn't want to do it. And then nobody's interested anymore. You had your moment and you lost. which is terrible because I would go, look at the figures. Look how many comic books Deadpool sells, and look at this, and look, he sells action figures, and he's really popular. And I would write him every month, and Tom or Jim Giannopoulos would write back to me and say, Tim, we love your enthusiasm, but no, thank you. But we never stopped. And Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick, the writers, and Jonathan Comack Martin, who was Ryan's producing partner, we never gave up. I asked Jim Cameron to write a letter, and he wrote a letter, and we got to do a PG-13 draft. And then David Fincher called Jim Giannopoulos and said, Tim's would make a great film, and give him a shot. And, we would try all these things, the four of us together. And then three things happened. The test leaked, and number one, the internet went crazy. And then number two, Rhett and Paul got Simon Kinberg on board. They sent him the script. Simon read it and said, this is great. I'll help push it. And he was the gatekeeper for all the Fox stuff. And then Emma Watts really saw that R-rated comic book movies are a business opportunity. It's a place in the market where Marvel, Disney, Marvel, and Warner Brothers were unlikely to follow. They ultimately did, of course, but at that time,
it was a long journey to that, though.
Yeah, it was a long journey, and off we went.
Well, yeah, and then you're directing a movie, and you directed cinematics, but directing a big budget film for a studio, different thing. How did you approach that? Who were your partners who helped you set that up for yourself? Because it's a learning experience. You have your confidence, obviously, but how do you approach that? And also still run your company at the same time, Tim?
Blur was at a place where we had a lot of really great people who could step in and cover for me. And in fact, the company did better after I went to direct Deadpool. We made more money the year I left than any year in any other, which should tell you something. But honestly, I think this is the key. And I give this advice to everyone. And Jeff Fowler, who's on his third Sonic movie, I hired him out of college, so he was here. You can't pretend, right? When I directed Deadpool, I was 50, and there was a lot of stuff I don't know. I still don't know. But I had the confidence to say, I don't know this, help me. And that is incredibly useful. People are happy to help you. And so I said, listen, I have a vision for this, but I don't know how to get it there. I don't know how to do it. You guys all know my job and yours better than me. So please help me. And everybody helps you get there. And so it's a really great experience for everybody, I think. I mean, it was certainly a great experience for me. And if you pretend that you know, or you try and be that person that is afraid to show that they don't know, then people know you don't know. And they just talk shit behind your back, and you don't get the benefit of their help. As a director, you accrue this ridiculous amount of credit for anything, whereas it really should be dispersed among the whole crew. So there was no downside to me. I never felt like my authority was threatened or people were working against me. I think just admitting that you don't know everything means that people can feel comfortable about helping you.
I've heard you say you even asked your script supervisor, what can I do better?
Oh, yeah.
I think that it just shows that you see that it's collaboration, right?
And her answer it's always been a she on all my movies, different she's, but her answer is always, you shoot too many wide masters. But I can't seem to break that habit, because that's kind of where I find, do you say this line as you're walking up to the table, or do you walk up, sit down, and then say the line? Because once you shoot that wide master, you're locked into that, whatever you did. And because then you go in tight, right? But, then when you get into the close coverage, if the guy says the line when he's sitting down, well, he's got to do that from now on. And famously, actors don't really start acting in earnest till you go into the medium close-ups. Yeah. Right. And so anyway, I that's where I kind of work it out. And I only have one directing. I'm not even going to say it's a style. I'm just trying to do what people would do. What would people do in this situation? Yeah. And you could go, what would people do if they were afflicted by cancer, but also superheroes? What would they do? Because I want it to feel grounded and realistic. I don't want it to feel like some heightened reality.
Well, you've said before also that, your everyday life skills help contribute to making you a director, right? And that seems to be part of that, like your life experience and what you do every day, right?
If you say so. But what do you think I meant by that?
I think what you mean is that if you have to be a human walking around in the world, don't stop being a human when you're directing, because you have to connect with people. You have to understand where they're coming from, because you have a group of people you have to guide towards something. And if you don't recognize that,
I want people to like the process and like me and like working with me, because I feel like that you get the better out of them. Some people prefer fear. I just never thought that worked well. I may have meant, I am a keen observer of people, and I'm always trying to figure out what motivates them or why they do what they do. We had another guy here who was a director, and he really was kind of a loner. He was not unfriendly or anything like that. He thought a lot. He was very technical and very innerly focused. And he made these beautiful short films, but he said, I want to do bigger films. I want to be Steven Spielberg. And I said, well, you have to like people and watch people and understand people and engage with them. And your methodology in the films you make are really like, what can I do on my own as a filmmaker? Because that's what you want to do what you want. You want to do it your way, and you want to do as much of it as possible yourself. And I said, that's not a way to make those kinds of movies. You can make really beautiful films, but you can't make Steven Spielberg's type of films, which are really all about the humanity of it. But people don't want to hear things like that. He got angry.
Honestly, Tim, that's so deeply perceptive, because different people hear things differently. If you really want to understand people and managing people and mentoring people, you have to understand how they hear things too, right? And so you were just trying to say, you have to listen, and that's an important part of the target that you have. Your target can be different,
Yeah, and I was also saying, look, play to your strengths.
Yeah.
You're frustrated, in my opinion. I mean, nobody has to listen. This is just me offering. I was talking to another director here who, we had some. There was like a little simmering thing for a while, and we finally broke through, and I said, look, you feel like, because I come from a story place where it's all about reading and books and I'm always talking about story and character, and he is more of a visualist. Don't feel like I'm judging you because you don't read as much as I do, because you can do these incredible shots that on my fucking best day, I couldn't come up with those.
Yeah.
And they're different styles of directing, and you do that great. If you're going to direct, we'll get you a great story person to support you. If I'm going to direct, I need a great camera operator and a great DP to help me, because those aren't my strengths. And that's okay. I think you just understanding where your weaknesses are and getting the right people to help you is key. Every director does that, whether they admit it or not. They gather this group of people around them who are like-minded and who fill in their weaknesses.
Do you see yourself as a mentor when you're telling people these things?
I don't think of it that way, because even though I'm old, I'm going to be 60 in a couple of months. I feel like I'm just trying to help a friend. But mentoring, I think, takes more discipline than I'm willing to give. It's like, somebody asked me to be an EP on a film where they had written to me, and I'd said, hey, I would do it this way, and I would suggest this, and once you call this person, they can help you out. And then it got to the point where they said, well, can I pay you? Like, we'll give you a big chunk. It was a sizable chunk of money. We'll give you to be an EP, and then you can help with this process. And I'm like, no. First of all, I don't want the money. But secondly, that obligates me to do it. I'm happy to help somebody and give them some advice. But if somebody gives me money, well, then, that's a whole other level of responsibility. Then I owe you something, versus being able to say, yeah, I'm sorry, I got shit to do. I can't talk to you anymore about it. And I don't want the obligation. And I guess that's what mentoring would feel like. But I do enjoy pointing it out, like another of the directors here. It was a younger guy. I was quite frankly giving him a pretty hard critique. And I said, listen, man, all this aside, what you're doing is fucking great. And let me show you what I was doing when I was your age. And I happened to be like, he was like 30, he's like 34 or something. So I pulled up some stuff from the first years of Blur, which of course is utter fucking shite. And I'm like, this is what I was doing. And so proud of it. And look at what you're doing at the same age. You will destroy me. But by the time you get more experience, you're going to be so much better than I was, because you're already 100 times better than I was at your age. I enjoy that, giving them perspective, because it's true, you know?
Yeah. Well, I got news for you, my friend. That is mentoring without the long-term obligation of it.
It's bite-sized mentor snacks.
Those are sometimes the things that stay with people the longest, you know?
You know who's best at that? In fact, I've heard his friends say they're going to collect it in a book sometimes. Fincher. They're like little fucking haikus. I was having trouble with Deadpool because it was the first live action film. And I said, dude, where do I put the camera? And I don't understand coverage. And he would write something like, I think the only job of a director is to know where to put the camera and for how long. Or another one I really loved, he said, film is about the expansion and compression of time.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and very simple and very true, right?
Do you think of him as a mentor for you?
Absolutely. He wouldn't say that. When we were doing heavy metal and pitching that, it took so many meetings. I mean, I shit you not, like a fucking 100 meetings we took to try and sell that project. And when you go to meet with David, and this was pre-Deadpool, and even now it wouldn't make much difference. David's the alpha dog in the fucking room, you know, he's the OG. And so we would meet with heads of studios and Tom Cruise and and I would be there, but they're focused on David. So I get to watch, right? I get to study how he handles the conversations. And he's very different than I am. Smart and poised and calculating, whereas I'm just like, bleh. But I still learned a lot by having a seat at the table at the highest level and watching someone who is a real mastery of understanding the filmmaking process and the business of filmmaking. It's such an education for me.
I've talked to David before, and I've seen him once in an interview where he talked about when he was working on the Aliens movie, and Joel Schumacher gave him advice. And the advice that Joel Schumacher gave him was, David, you can't care more than they do.
And he was talking about the studio?
Yeah, exactly. But Dave was like, I can't take that advice. And I feel like how you guys map together is you care very deeply about the projects you're working on.
Yeah. You know, Julian Clark, who's edited the movies I made, Julian is great, but he says, you know, there's two types of directors in his experiences. They're the ones that come in here and there during the editorial process. And then there's the grinders. He's like, you're a grinder. I can't imagine not giving it everything you have. I can't imagine not caring. And it's not like it's a burden or an onus. Sometimes it is, but mostly you do it because you love it, you know?
Yeah. Do you ever protect yourself a little bit from the care? Because sometimes when you care so much, it can be hurtful when a project doesn't go the way you want it to. And I know in this business that happens all the time, right?
I'm pretty good about that. I mean, when it finally comes time to lose, I'll fight tooth and nail when I feel like I have a chance. But when the bell rings and the round is over, I'm pretty good about walking away. You know, even with, you know, Jim Cameron and I famously fought on Terminator, which is the thing that kind of will bond us past that experience. And which Jim says, you know, it's like, look, it's two creative people who had a difference of opinion, but he loves the movie. We both love sci-fi and fantasy, and we're both nerds. And that's a bond that's, you can get away with a few disagreements. I
know that you're a big Joe Abercrombie fan.
Yes.
And you have, so what's the book of his that you're going to make into a movie? What is it? Which one what are you targeting?
Well, I want to make them all. I can spend the rest of my career making Joe's books. Mm-hmm. All of them are good. Every single one. If you were going to read them, I would start at the beginning. Best Served Cold is the fourth book about a mercenary general who grows too powerful And so her boss tries to kill her. And it's Kill Bill meets Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say when it will be made because you know how Hollywood works. The strikes were not helpful to the process. And I can't tell you when we're going to get that momentum back again. But I can say this, I will make that fucking film. I will not fail. Like The Goon. I will make The Goon someday.
Yeah. I love it.
Nothing has ever been easy, Heavy Metal was years and hundreds of meetings. Deadpool was years and hundreds of meetings. First Law, Joe Abercrombie's stuff has been, even though that one was announced late, it was after years of working with Joe. And we work on a lot of other things together too. He's my favorite person on the planet.
What does creativity and imagination mean to you?
Creativity is finding an innovative way to do something that's been done in the past to solve a problem. Or, I guess a story problem is not a problem, but what's the best solution here? I think that's being creative. How do I make this come together in a new and interesting way? Imagination is just the process that you go through to get there. Everybody has their own tricks for these sorts of things, but you said at the beginning, it was about the creative process. And I found this trick that worked extremely well for me for years and still does. Maybe it won't work for other people, but I tell all the directors here, and so I'll share it, which is sometimes you have a problem, like a creative problem to solve. Like I have to come up with an idea for a commercial, or I have to come up with an idea for a video game story or a scene. I found it's super useful you have this idea in your mind of the problem that you're trying to solve. Like I'll use an example, like a Batman movie or a commercial that the client said, I want to see a Batman commercial where Batman doesn't throw a punch. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, well, what would that be? And he's like, I don't know, man. You're the creative guy. So you have an idea about, we're going to do a Batman commercial. It has to be different. And that's in your head. And then I find books on annuals on photography or illustration where every page is a new image. It might be a museum exhibition catalog or whatever, but every page is different. And that idea is floating there in the back of my head, and the visual input is coming in differently every time. And for some reason, those two things come together in my subconscious, and I'll come out of, an hour of doing that, and I'll have 2 or 3 ideas. What if we see Batman growing up in close-ups throughout his life, and he's always being punched or put down or abused, and then he decides to fight back right at the end.
Wow.
But whatever, you come up with a bunch of different little ideas that then you can expand upon. But it's that blank canvas moment that's hard to get past, and that is very helpful, I find.
Well, Tim, I know you don't think you're a mentor, but I felt mentored by this conversation.
Well, hold on a second. You do this with everybody. What's the single best piece of advice or 2 that you've learned from creative people where somebody said, this is what I do, or this is the way I think, or this is the way I view the world?
One of the ones I did was with one of my very close friends, and he's a refugee and LGBTQ. He's born in Iran. And one of the things that he said, and I think this resonated with Aaron as well, our producer, is that goals, not plans, because your plans are going to have to change all the time.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I use the no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Yeah, that's great.
I read a really great book from Andy Dukes, who is a psychologist and a poker player. And I'm not a poker player. I think it's called Thinking in Bets. But one of the things in one chapter went over goals, and they've studied the fact that, most people go, I'm going to imagine a goal and how I would get there. And I'm going to imagine the steps I need to take to get from here to there. But they actually have a higher rate of success if they imagine themselves at that goal and failing. And they look backwards and say, what didn't I do that led to me failing at my goal? What didn't I plan for that led to this moment? It's just like looking at something from the other side. And it actually, for whatever reason, like, I don't know how it works inside the brain, but it motivated them in a way that was more effective than thinking about your success.
That's really interesting. I wonder if that's all tied to like fight or flight and what really programs humans to be motivated. Because sometimes we gravitate towards how do we get away from the disaster versus what is the success?
It's because the disaster has such a high penalty. I read a lot I'm really interested in nonfiction too, but when you think about, I can't remember what I was reading, but when you think, okay, you're a primitive man on the plain and you're walking to the water hole and you hear a rustling in the bushes, just like we're all prone to look at negative news and clickbait that has the negative headlines, that rustling in the tall grass, everybody looks, right? And you go, well, fuck, 99 times out of 100, it's nothing. But the evolutionary cost of looking every time is nothing compared to not looking the one time that it's a lion. So evolution has kind of programmed you to, that's cheap. Fear is cheap compared to being eaten, and not a very effective strategy for your genes. I love those little psychological things. Andy Duke's book is really great, but I highly recommend all the Malcolm Gladwell books.
Do you listen to his podcast?
No, I don't, but I always listen to his books on tape. And anybody who wants to read Joe Abercrombie's books, I highly recommend listening to them, because the gentleman that reads them, Stephen Pacey, is amazing. I've listened to all of his books, and there's 12 of them. Mm-hmm. I've listened to them all 8 times through. It's fucking crazy. But anyway, Annie Dukes has this chapter where she talks about people, they're even pros at playing poker, where they'll get inordinately influenced by winning or by losing. And she said, you listen to people in the tournament, what's going on. You might hear somebody getting a little louder in anger or joy. And she calls it, they're in tilt, which means that their emotions have started to overwhelm the logic and strategy of the game. And you don't make good decisions when you're in tilt, which, anybody that's ever walked away from an argument has realized that, fuck, it was probably smart to walk away, because I would have said some things that were not smart.
It's so interesting you said that, because this digital world that we live in now, like online, social media, all that, it emphasizes the tilt, right?
Yeah.
Like you constantly want to react.
And it has the double whammy of being anonymous most of the time, I've never had a social media account, nor will I ever, because A, I don't think anybody wants to know my opinion. And B, I don't want to get caught up in that world of trying to prove I'm right or prove someone else is wrong. It's just such a waste of time.
I mean, there's something to be said about debating. I love a good debate. My husband, my maiden name was Van Riemsdyk, and my husband likes to call it I'm Van Riemsdyking, because I will be debating. And my family will get together and have big debates over things that we're all fundamentally agreeing on, but we've had to find some angle where we disagree on it in some way, shape, or form.
Well, America seems to be in that frame of mind where we've unlearned the process of healthy debates, but I still like it. One of the authors, John Scalzi, who's written a lot of Love, Death, and Robots, he lives in Ohio. He doesn't necessarily believe what a lot of his neighbors do, but they're his neighbors and their kids are friends of his kids. And it creates a different sort of world that you don't get online. One of the big things about Zoom and the new work world, which, a lot of people like, I do not. I miss having the artists around all the time. I miss those casual conversations that happen in the kitchen while you're getting coffee. Those are the things that make you relate to people and feel close. I would have a hard time firing someone who I saw every day and who I ate lunch with every day, much harder than someone who was just a face on Zoom. That's just monkey brain shit, but it's true, And I, especially for our industry, it saddens me, because I felt when I got into this business, it was this exclusive club. And I felt like this, I'd been led into the temple to learn its mysteries, and all these other people were around me. You're not going to make an appointment to ask somebody a question. It's tough. I don't think it's tenable. Maybe that sounds a little anachronistic, and we'll just find a different way of doing it. But, if I had to spend the first 3 years of my time in this business working at my mom's house instead of at a studio around other people, I think it would have been a very different experience.
And also there's people can be a pain, but they can also be fun. And like you can laugh about things and it's organic. One of my pet peeves is being in a call and it's like, all right, let me click the digital raise my hand. And you wait to get called on.
That's not the way we were made. I'm hoping that it doesn't last.
I do think that we have found that like people come back more when they actually run into people that they know and they're like, oh yeah, I like you,
Yeah.
It's a messy business right now, man.
It is. And who knows where it will be.
That's the mess of it, right?
Or the joy of it. I do know one thing. I think where Blur is trying to go is creating more of our own content, which everybody will say. But I think that there's so much churn in the studio system and so much fear that I really feel like the way to get things done is to find things that are great and find the money to make it outside the studio system. So you're not beholden to an executive that may not want to stick their neck out, or they may change jobs next week, or, there's so many reasons to say no when you're inside the studio system. If I can make a movie for $50 million, I might be able to find that and then sell it to them. They need the content, but they're afraid to make it. So
yeah, it has to be less their risk, I think. And I think probably one of their biggest challenges watching the market is everybody wants the studios to be tech companies, but they're not. And they're not going to make that revenue. And so the market punishes them for that.
Yeah. Why can't we just be satisfied with a reasonable return on our investment?
I totally agree. There's a finite amount of growth that you get in any industry because you run out of people eventually.
It was interesting when somebody finally explained sort of the logic behind the tentpole trend. Like why do they only do tentpoles? And when you look at the math, you go, okay, well, because no amount of small movies is going to make enough money, and you have to do the tentpoles. And even if some of them fail, the ones that succeed make far more money than any number of low and mid budget, unless you get some kind of lottery ticket one, like some of the smaller horror movies that are made or Deadpool for that matter. But what was successful about Deadpool in part was that I made it for what was a fairly reasonable budget. I've been supremely lucky in my life. There is not a luckier nerd on the planet. And I include my failures in that, because if you win all the time, that doesn't make you a good person, or I don't consider myself a good person, but it doesn't make you an interesting person, and it doesn't teach you anything. So I don't regret my failures either. I'm never the smartest person in the room. And I've come to accept that. When you work with guys like Fincher and Cameron, you just go, well, fuck, I'm never going to be that good. And that's okay. Better than most people. but
Well, that's because you're a creative. So thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Everyone Is. Everyone Is produced and edited by Chris Hawkinson. Executive producer is Aaron Dussault. Music by Doug Infinite. Our logo and graphic design is by Harrison Parker, and I am Jen Coronado. Everyone Is a Slightly Disappointed Productions production, dropping every other Thursday wherever podcasts are available. Make sure to rate and review, and maybe even like and subscribe. Thank you for listening.